Thank you. Boy, I have to live up to that and that. The test isn't whether they applaud when you're introduced, it's whether they applaud when you finish. Anyway, we'll see. Anyway, I am delighted to be here, and it's an honor to be here at the Clinton School. I had an opportunity earlier today to visit the library, which is spectacular, not only as architecture, but as history and as historical storytelling. And you all have every right to be enormously proud, not only of your favorite son, but of his continuing legacy, which really this school represents. No doubt. First of all, let me ask you, how many, do we have students from the school? Great. You will hear, no doubt, all about politics and theory and statistical analysis and all of that. And I'm here to tell you that that's true, but it's not the whole truth. In my experience, politics is about people. First and always, it's what people do for each other and sometimes what they do to each other. And I give you one small example. I'm here a little bit late, but in no small measure because Skip Rutherford and his boss 10 years ago, last month, corrected a historical oversight. Adam mentioned my association with the Ford Library and Museum, and some of you may know I had the privilege in his later years of not only working with, but getting pretty close to President Ford and the family. And Mrs. Ford, of course, received, deservedly, the Medal of Freedom from the first President Bush. And it was characteristic of Gerald Ford that he not only didn't complain, he was enormously proud. He was enormously proud of everything that Mrs. Ford did. And he was always glad to see her recognized. So it fell to his friends and admirers to sort of supply that missing ego. And that's what we did. And really, Skip Rutherford, more than anyone else, is responsible for going to President Clinton and seeing that on the 25th anniversary of Gerald Ford's East Room inauguration, a historical oversight was corrected, and President Ford received from President Clinton the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So I am discharging my debt this evening, among other things. I promise to, in return for your hospitality, try to keep in mind Lincoln's cautionary description of a long-winded Springfield lawyer of his acquaintance, whose singular talent it was to compress the most words into the smallest ideas of anyone he knew. With Lincoln, of course, the opposite holds true. With a spare eloquence that has never been equaled, he reminded his countrymen, quote, "We cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation." A century and a half later, it might be said that we cannot escape Lincoln. This year's bicentennial has brought a flood of new books. From Hollywood comes word that Steven Spielberg is about to do for our 16th president what he did earlier for E.T. and Indiana Jones. Few among Lincoln's contemporaries could have imagined such a legacy. Case in point, quote, "Mr. Lincoln will go down to posterity as the man who could not read the signs of the times, who plunged his country into a great war without a plan, who failed without excuse, and who fell without a friend." So declared the august London Times in the autumn of 1864. Harsher still were the criticisms directed his way by Lincoln's war-weary countrymen. Once asked how it felt to be president in such contentious times, Lincoln compared himself to the man who, having been ridden out of town on a rail, announced, "If it wasn't for the honor of the thing, I'd rather walk." This comes as a surprise to most modern-day Americans, many of whom assume that Lincoln was born on Mount Rushmore. How, they ask, could the most polarizing president of his time become, over time, the president against whom all others are measured? Clearly, then, part of the Lincoln legacy is to be wary of anyone who presumes to define a president's legacy at least until sufficient time has passed to allow the cooling of passions and the opening of papers. And that is a message, I think, of particular relevance to the Clinton Library. Harry Truman might have been thinking of Lincoln when he defined a statesman as a politician who's been dead for 20 years. Well, I would go a step further than Mr. Truman. As Adam indicated to you, I think Lincoln is the president against whom all others are measured for a number of reasons. But if I had to boil it down into a single one, I would say because, in my opinion, he is the greatest politician who ever inhabited the White House. Now, I realize that that sounds like faint praise to some of you, at a time when politicians as a class are held in somewhat lower regard than investment bankers. The very word politics has come to be seen as a synonym for raised voices and focus grouped convictions, for an electoral process wherein candidates see our differences as something to be exploited rather than bridged. What could Lincoln possibly have with this kind of politics? Well, the fact of the matter is, for much of his life, he was a partisan wheelhorse, a strict party man who craved recognition and a status far removed from his humble origins. Remember, it wasn't the $10 a month flatboatman to whom Lincoln's social philosophy paid tribute. It was a political and social system that allowed that flatboatman to stop being a flatboatman and to climb the ladder professionally, culturally, and in the opinion of his neighbors. For Lincoln himself, life was a fiery trial, one whose ultimate reward was the good opinion of his fellow citizens and the chance to be honorably remembered to the latest generation. Law may have been his livelihood, but politics was his life. Needless to say, the idea of a scheming, politically consumed Lincoln hardly squares with Carl Sandburg's dreamy idealist who halts in the middle of the road to rescue a pig stuck in the mud, or the upright store clerk who walks miles to return a few cents to an inadvertently short-changed customer. That's the Lincoln we all grew up with. That's the Lincoln who inhabits his temple in Washington. That's the Lincoln of Carl Sandburg. The great literary critic Edmund Wilson declared in the 1930s that Sandburg was the worst thing to happen to Lincoln since John Wilkes Booth. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say this: Sandburg's Lincoln is summoned by destiny, not unlike his youthful hero George Washington, that other presidential icon with whom he reappears out of the historical mists each February to sell us appliances and used cars before vanishing into the swamp of textbook history. Quote, "It isn't a pleasant thing to think that when we die, that is the last of us." Abraham Lincoln was 22 years old when he made that bleak observation to a New Salem acquaintance. Haunted by the premature deaths of his mother and sister, his subsequent entry into politics was no coincidence. As I said, it afforded the common man a chance to be uncommon, to escape common origins. It also staked a claim to posterity's notice, perhaps even to the secular immortality young Lincoln associated with George Washington ever since, as a boy, he had read Parson Weems' sugary biography of our first president. 8 years in the Illinois legislature only whetted his appetite for advancement. Now, if you should hear anyone say that Lincoln don't want to go to Congress, he told a supporter in 1843, I wish you would tell him you have reason to believe he is mistaken. The truth is, I would like to go very much. 3 years would pass, and by the way, one unsuccessful campaign, before Lincoln got his wish. In December 1847, he first set eyes on Washington, all marble and mud. Some things never change. Gaslight had only recently come to Pennsylvania Avenue on the nights Congress was in session. Barely 2 weeks in the job, Congressman Lincoln rose from his back row desk to introduce the spot resolutions. Remember, the Mexican-American War was raging, tearing the country apart. Lincoln and those who shared Lincoln's view, particularly towards slavery, believed it was an immoral conflict. believed that it was a conflict in many ways started by President Polk and his administration in a deliberate effort to annex large parts of Mexico and therefore acquire additional territory for slavery. So Abraham Lincoln, this very logical lawyer and very ambitious young politician, gets up days after he arrives in Washington, and he introduces a resolution that would require President Polk to identify the precise spot on the map where Mexican aggression had spilled American blood, the act cited by the president and others to justify U.S. military action against our neighbor to the south, a Gulf of Tonkin resolution in reverse. Lincoln's proposal reflected his opposition to the war, and for this opposition, he paid a high price. A Springfield newspaper compared spotty Lincoln to Benedict Arnold. Soon after, dissatisfied with life in a Washington boarding house, Mary Lincoln took their 2 sons and retreated to her father's comfortable brick house in Lexington, Kentucky. Lonely and depressed, Lincoln feared his boys might forget him altogether. His attempt to legislate an end to slavery in the District of Columbia was no more successful than his campaign to secure a patronage job at the end of his single term in Congress. That's right, Lincoln lined up all sorts of letters of endorsement from friends trying to get Zachary Taylor to make him commissioner of the Public Land Office, a sinecure that would pay $3,000 a year. He was unsuccessful in this, but his willingness as a young man to feed at the public trough gave poignancy to Lincoln's later dealings with the horde of office seekers who infested his White House. Transforming misery through humor, he once declared himself happy to have contracted a mild form of smallpox because, as he put it, now at last I have something I can give everyone. In the spring of 1849, he returned to Springfield, his political career in tatters. He would be little noted nor long remembered, but for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, enacted in 1854 by his Springfield neighbor and adversary, Stephen Douglas, an act which effectively repealed long-standing restrictions on the spread of slavery into the nation's territories. Overnight, Lincoln found his voice and his moral compass. Repeal the Missouri Compromise, he exclaimed in anger. Repeal all compromises. Repeal the Declaration of Independence. Repeal all past history. You still cannot repeal human nature. It still will be the abundance of man's heart that slavery's extension is wrong. And out of the abundance of his heart, his mouth will continue to speak. That same Kansas-Nebraska Act and the violence it provoked touched off a political earthquake. Overnight, Lincoln's Whig Party disintegrated beneath his feet, and he was faced with a defining choice. Should he join the new anti-slavery Republican Party, or throw in his lot with the apparently more popular anti-immigrant American Party, popularly dubbed the Know-Nothings for their secretive rituals? This is how Lincoln phrased his response. I am not a know-nothing. This is certain. How could I be? How could anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I shall prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Out of the chrysalis of the turbulent 1850s emerged a new Lincoln. Not someone crafted by political handlers and spin doctors, but someone forged in a moral furnace. Someone very different from the congressional tactician and reflexive partisan of the 1840s. Once, for example, his sharp tongue had cut himself as often as it had his political adversaries. Now, Lincoln learned to aim his jests at himself, poking fun at his appearance the way Ronald Reagan used to joke about his age. One of his favorite stories was that of a homely man who, riding through the woods one day, chanced upon a woman also on horseback. As he turned off the path to let her pass, she addressed him directly. "I do believe you are the ugliest man I ever saw." "That might be," the traveler replied, "but I can't help it." "No, you can't help it," the woman thoughtfully conceded, "but you might stay at home." Lincoln had particular reason not to stay at home. His marriage was a classic case of opposites attracting and then repelling. Under the circumstances, his relationship with the former Mary Todd of Lexington, Kentucky, might best be understood in terms instantly recognizable to this or any 21st century audience. It was a political partnership. Mary Todd Lincoln gets a bum rap from history and most historians. The fact that 3 of her 4 children died, and she saw her husband assassinated, and the surviving son briefly put her in a mental institution, I think I'd cut her a little bit of slack. But in any event, you can decide for yourself where Mary belongs historically. What we do know is that she was a woman ahead of her time. What brought her together with this very unlikely beau, you know, he was 6'4", she was just under 5 feet. There's not a single, there's no daguerreotype of the Lincolns together. It's theorized because Mary was embarrassed by the disparity in their heights. Abraham Lincoln made it worse when they were introduced to people, and he would say, "Here's the long and the short of it." You can imagine how many times Mary heard that one-liner and was probably sick of it. The fact is, what brought them together was Henry Clay. Henry Clay was Lincoln's political hero. Henry Clay happened to be a good friend of Mary's father in Lexington, Kentucky. So Henry Clay, in a sense, is the matchmaker that brought these two people together. But the complication is young, well-bred, well-read, French-speaking belles in the 1850s weren't supposed to sully their head with politics. Lincoln, I think, instinctively understood Mary was, in addition to all of her charms, which are real, was unlike any other woman he'd ever met or was likely to meet. She played at politics vicariously through her husband. As fiercely loyal as a Nancy Reagan or a Hillary Clinton, Mary Lincoln glimpsed a destiny visible to few others. For all that, it is true the Quaker Brown residence at the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield may well be considered the original house divided. There are simply too many contemporary accounts that have Mary striking her husband with a stick of wood, or hurling hot coffee in his face, or driving him to take refuge on an extra long sofa in the offices of Lincoln and Herndon to be dismissed as mere neighborhood gossip. Yet this, too, had its educational uses. For if a long-suffering Lincoln refused to be rattled by conflict in the White House, perhaps it was because he had learned to accept conflict in his own house. Quarrel not at all, he advised others. No man resolved to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Lincoln would take his own advice, and in doing so, he would forge a presidency whose self-denying civility was all the more remarkable given the hatred directed his way. On the eve of his presidency, he was nothing if not a work in progress. Adam referred to his capacity for growth. That, I think, along with his political gifts, are what stamp Lincoln uniquely as the president against whom all others are measured. This is a man who outgrew not only his youthful ambition, his desire for status and recognition and place. More importantly, this is a man who never stopped growing, who never lost the capacity to learn from experience, including his own mistakes. And finally, in a way that I think speaks to all of us today, especially today, given the headlines, This was a man who outgrew the racist culture that produced him. Now, it's one thing to be anti-slavery, and that was certainly a minority view at the time. It's one thing to argue legalistically that slavery should not spread into the territories. Lincoln was not legalistic in his opposition to slavery. He said there was never a time in his life when slavery didn't have the power to make him miserable. He was still an infant when his parents left Kentucky, moved to Indiana, in part because they wanted to leave a slave state for a free state. They joined a sect of the Baptist Church that was abolitionist in its politics. That said, as advanced as Lincoln was seen throughout much of the North and God knows in the South, it's one thing to embrace the cause of anti-slavery. It's another, in the context of the mid-19th century, to accept social equality between the races. And that is Lincoln's ultimate achievement, as important as anything else that happened during his 4 years in the White House. I'm like a man so busy in letting rooms in one end of his house, he said early in his term, that he can't stop to put out the fire burning in the other. The Union was crumbling, Washington itself faced a military invasion, and the untested president confronted dangers anywhere he looked. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Lincoln was not afraid to take them. The fact of the matter is, another reason why he matters, why he is contemporary, why we still debate Abraham Lincoln, is because he invented the wartime presidency, including actions that some people regard as invasions of civil liberties. Asserting executive authority as no president before or since, his suspension of the cherished constitutional guarantee of habeas corpus led critics then and historians since to speak of incipient dictatorship. Lincoln justified his action under the doctrine of wartime necessity. Wartime necessity would be Franklin Roosevelt's explanation for the incarceration of 110,000 Japanese Americans. Wartime necessity would be Harry Truman's justification for seizing the steel mills during the Korean War. Wartime necessity would be Lyndon Johnson's and Richard Nixon's explanation for the excesses of their own government during Vietnam. It's not fair to blame Abraham Lincoln for what later presidents did with his doctrine, but it is certainly debatable. You know your geography. The District of Columbia is like a nut in a nutcracker. And the two jaws are Maryland to the north and Virginia to the south. Virginia had already seceded. Maryland was making noises about doing the same thing. If the Maryland legislature met and voted an ordinance of secession, it would have an enormously dire impact upon the war. Well, they didn't meet. Some of them went to jail, conveniently. Along with others who were accused of, among other things, blowing up bridges to prevent Northern troops from passing through the sacred soil of Maryland. Anticipating claims that reverberate through today's headlines, Lincoln said unprecedented circumstances authorized him to temporarily suspend a single clause of the Constitution. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, he asked, and the government itself to go to pieces, lest that one be violated? In other words, what Lincoln is saying is, rather than yield to rebels who would tear up the entire Constitution, I will temporarily suspend one clause in that Constitution. And then he found that marvelous gift he had for taking abstractions and legalisms and putting them in language that anyone could understand. As he put it, often a limb must be amputated to save a life, but a life is never wisely given to save a limb. Some thought his use of language unpresidential. The public printer of the United States appointed it his mission to come to the White House one day and protest against the president's use of the phrase sugar-coated in a state paper. He took it on himself to remind the president of the difference between a message to Congress and an Illinois stump speech. John, Lincoln replied, that term expresses my idea, and I'm not going to change it. Sugar-coated must stand. The time will never come in this country when the people will not understand exactly what sugar-coated means. The fact of the matter is, Lincoln is our first and arguably greatest communicator in the White House. As for the talk of dictatorship, well, I tell you, he was a pretty generous dictator. Remember the incident where he had appointed General McClellan, who was better at organizing armies than leading them? He once said McClellan was a great engineer. The problem was he was a stationary engineer. One evening, President Lincoln decided to go over to General McClellan's home in Washington, which tells you something, first of all, already, rather than summoning the general to him. Anyway, went over there, unaccompanied by anyone except his secretary, John Hay. They went to the general's home. The general was out, apparently at a party. And they said, that's fine, we'll wait. So the president and his secretary go, and they sit in the general's parlor. An hour goes by. The door opens. They can hear the low voices. The general has returned. He's talking to the servant at the door. And then he goes upstairs to bed. And the servant walks in, no doubt feeling somewhat embarrassed, and explains to the President of the United States that General McClellan has retired for the evening. Lincoln says nothing. On the way back to the White House, John Hay says plenty. He's livid at this disrespect that the commanding general has shown to the commander-in-chief. And Lincoln says, I would hold McClellan's horse if he will give us victories. That's the dictator, Lincoln. A successful president combines principle and pragmatism. For years, Lincoln had fantasized that African colonization or financial compensation to slaveholders might somehow cut the racial Gordian knot. By the summer of 1862, he knew better. The war was not going well, to put it mildly. He understood that it was hypocritical for a nation professing a love of liberty to keep millions of human beings in chains. But as with his suspension of habeas corpus, political imperatives transcended personal desires. He had convinced himself he must do nothing to alienate Kentucky and the other border states, hostile to emancipation, profoundly racist, and teetering on the knife's edge of secession. There was another reason that is often overlooked. That same General McClellan, when he deigned to sit down with the president, took it upon himself to write the president very explicit letters of advice, which read more like ultimata. And among other things, he told the president not even to think about emancipation, that this army that he was commanding would dissolve overnight if the president took such a step, that white men would not spill their blood to free the black man. Now, Lincoln didn't believe it, but he couldn't dismiss it out of hand. It's one more element that he had to take into consideration. So what does he do? There's the public Lincoln, and there's the private Lincoln. Horace Greeley, the gadfly New York editor, who's always showering the president with advice, takes him to task publicly for not moving more aggressively on emancipation. And Lincoln writes him one of his patented public letters. I would save the Union, he told Greeley. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. He was careful, even there, to add a postscript to this harsh formula, asserting that nothing in his official conduct should modify, quote, my oft-expressed personal, underlined, personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. That was the public Lincoln. Lincoln writing for General McClellan and for his critics and for all those cautious people out there. Privately, at the very moment he's writing to Greeley that he has no plans to move forward with emancipation, the fact is he's writing the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. Within days, he writes to a friend back in Illinois that he is ready to declare emancipation, quote, when he was convinced that it could be made effective and that the people were with him. To Frederick Douglass, the Emancipation Proclamation was the greatest event of our nation's history. Lincoln himself would later describe it as the central act of my administration. He sang a very different tune at the time, portraying it as a wartime necessity and questioning whether, as he put it afterward, quote, the people had been quite educated up to it. Here is Lincoln, the persuader, forerunner of modern presidents for whom their chief occupation, in Harry Truman's words, is to convince people to do what they ought to do but don't want to do. So Lincoln proceeds with emancipation as a wartime necessity, but that has consequences. He gets to know Frederick Douglass. They meet at the White House more than once. Douglass goes out more than anyone else. He spearheads recruiting almost 200,000 African Americans, including 2 of his own sons. 30,000 of them will make the supreme sacrifice in fighting for their freedom. Abraham Lincoln, more than most of his contemporaries, looked at that, was profoundly moved by that, and had all his old caricatures, all his old stereotypes about what black people were capable of and not capable of shattered overnight by the reality of the heroism and the sacrifice and the spilling of blood that went on day after day after day. A hybrid of military necessity and moral imperative, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation all but guaranteed that neither England nor France would come to the rescue of Southern slavery by recognizing the Confederacy. It is the Lincoln presidency in microcosm. The majesty of emancipation, inseparable from the calculation of the professional politician and the chessboard maneuvering of the diplomatic strategist. And somehow, another reason why Lincoln lives for us is his humanity. Somehow, in the midst of the horror of this war, Lincoln never lost his sense of humor. Indeed, he required that sense of humor. Harry Truman, to quote Truman again, said that a president needs a backbone, but he needs a funny bone as well. And that if he didn't have a sense of humor, a man would go mad in the Oval Office. Office seekers were the bane of Lincoln's existence. One day there appeared outside his office a group advocating a candidate for commissioner of the Hawaiian Islands. Not only was he qualified for the post, said the man's friends, he needed it for the beneficial effects of the Hawaiian climate on his uncertain health. Lincoln cut them short. Gentlemen, he announced, there are 8 other applicants for that position, and they are all sicker than your man. Then there was a haughty female visitor who accosted the president at a White House reception and demanded that he give her son a colonel's commission, not as a favor, but as a right. Sir, she informed Lincoln, my grandfather fought at Lexington. My uncle was the only man who did not run away at Bladensburg. My father fought at New Orleans, sir, and my husband was killed at Monterey. Madam, Lincoln replied, your family has done enough for the country. It is time to give somebody else a chance. And finally, one of the president's most persistent callers came to him one day with the news that the chief of customs had just died. Could he possibly take his place? It's fine with me, said Lincoln, if the undertaker doesn't mind. 1864 was an election year, precluded from formal campaigning. Lincoln, the politician, used his bully pulpit to educate a war-weary republic as to the true meaning of this conflict. I happened temporarily to occupy this big White House, he told a visiting Ohio regiment. I am a living witness that any one of your children may look to come here as my father's child has. It is in order that each one of you may have an open field and a fair chance for your industry, enterprise, and intelligence, that you may all have equal privileges in the race of life. It is for this the struggle should be maintained, that we may not lose our birthright. That's all very well and good, sounds eloquent, maybe even persuasive, but you can be sure Lincoln did not stop with such homilies. The New York Herald's somewhat scandalous editor, James Gordon Bennett, had been a thorn in the side of the Lincoln administration. He was irresponsible, even by the standards, if you want to call them that, of 19th century journalism, constantly questioning the competence and the patriotism of not only the president, but of Mrs. Lincoln. This did not prevent the president from offering Bennett appointment as minister to France, which of course was not only magnanimous, but would also get him out of the country during the 1864 campaign. The president was not in the least bit reluctant to urge General Sherman to let his soldiers go home on furlough to vote in critical state elections. Thank God he did, because if he hadn't, Lincoln might not have been in a position during the first weeks of 1865 to twist just enough arms in Congress to pass the 13th Amendment. Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation as a wartime measure could, in theory, have disappeared with the Lincoln presidency. It had no constitutional force behind it. The only way you were going to remove the stain of slavery from American soil was to amend the Constitution. That's what Lincoln set out to do. He managed it with 3 votes to spare in the House of Representatives on the 1st of February, 1865. No wonder Frederick Douglass said the last days of Mr. Lincoln were his best days. His second inaugural address a month later is arguably the greatest lay sermon ever delivered on American soil. Fondly do we hope, said the president, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Thus did Abraham Lincoln come full circle, achieving the immortality he had dreamed of as a boy, not through the elections he won, but by the leadership he provided in the cause of popular government and in his personal transformation from ambitious office seeker to instrument of human liberation. To say he grew in office is to underestimate his true achievement. Long before his fateful visit to Ford's Theater, Lincoln's life had become a parable of sacrifice, not success. In his growing spirituality, he did not, like some modern-day politicians, presume to know God's agenda. Still less did he arrogate to himself the role of national theologian. It's been my experience, he once mused, that folks who have no vices generally have few virtues. One of the real odd couples in Washington was the president and William Seward, his Secretary of State. Lincoln, this great, tall, towering ascetic. Seward, short, great nose like a macaw, colorfully, flamboyantly dressed, always with a cigar, usually a profanity on his lips. But they connected, they bonded. They made each other laugh, which may be one of the ultimate human connections, particularly in times of incredible trial. In any event, there's a wonderful story, apparently true story. One day, the 2 men were en route outside of Washington on the way to Arlington to review troops. They were traveling in an ambulance over several miles of well-rutted roads. The driver was struggling to maintain control of his team, and as the roads got rougher, so did the stream of profanity issuing from his perch. Suddenly, the president poked his head out of the carriage and looked up. He said, "Driver, my friend, are you an Episcopalian?" "No," replied the driver. Truth be told, he wasn't much of anything. "If I go to church at all," he said, "I go to the Methodist Church." "Oh," said Lincoln, "excuse me. I thought you must be an Episcopalian, for you swear just like Secretary Seward, and he's a church warden." His death on Good Friday struck powerful chords among his contemporaries. Tolstoy called him Christ in miniature. At a particularly dark moment in his own fiery trial, Abraham Lincoln told us, quote, "The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion." I can think of no better yardstick with which to measure any president's legacy. We ask ourselves, generation after generation of our leaders, did he rise to the occasion, to the difficulties as well as the opportunities that defined his years in office? Did the force of his personality and the power of his ideas affect the way Americans live, how we see ourselves, how we relate to one another, and to the rest of the world? Did he spend himself in causes larger than himself, for purposes nobler than the Gallup poll? Did he make a significant difference, not just in his time, but for a long time to come? For if Lincoln teaches us anything, I think it is this, that leaders who uphold timeless principles, whatever price they may pay in the short term, will generally find time is on their side. In the end, nothing so vindicated his faith in democracy as the way he practiced a politics that elevates rather than divides. I love him not because he was perfect, said the great black sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, but because he was not, and yet triumphed. Please remember that the next time you are tempted to throw up your hands in despair over the course of American politics and the imperfection of American politicians. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. And first question, Larry.
There's a rumor that Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were related. Is that true?
Oh my God, I don't believe so, but you know, in Kentucky, anything's possible.
Right here, Bob.
I spent my summer vacation going to Springfield to see the museum and the library. And I couldn't help but think how much simpler it was for Skip to acquire the property and the papers and all of the things. And, you know, really you all did a remarkable job, but there's got to be a few stories there in the acquisition phase of how you found all that.
Well, it's very interesting. I won't bore you with the how-tos, but you might be interested to know, of course, the institution of the Presidential Library as we know it is a relatively recent one. Franklin Roosevelt, who really created the modern presidency, appropriate enough, created the Presidential Library. He was a great student of history. And it's interesting because FDR may have been a centralizer in some of his policies, but when it came to history, he was a great decentralizer. He understood that not all of our history is made or belongs in Washington, D.C. It should not be kept in some marble strongbox on Pennsylvania Avenue. It should be shared with the people who make it possible. And that meant creating a very modest Dutch fieldstone building that he designed on the Chicago Tribune, which hated his guts. The story, President Roosevelt today dedicated the library he built as a memorial to himself. Gives you an idea of the flavor of, criticism in the press is not anything new. Over the years, there's been a debate back and forth. Well, you know, there's a kind of surface logic. Why are we putting these papers all over America? Why don't we just build some, you know, additional marble palace in Washington and stick them all there, and then all the researchers can come there? Well, guess why we don't do that? If you want to understand Bill Clinton, you need to come to Little Rock. If you want to understand Harry Truman, you need to see Independence, Missouri. The fact of the matter is that Little Rock is as much a part of the exhibit, or Independence, or Hyde Park, or Abilene, or West Branch. The list goes on. There's another reason, going back to FDR's shrewdness in democratizing our history, in creating facilities unique in all the world. Before he did that, presidents not only took their papers with them, they were free to destroy them, to sell them. Chester Arthur, a couple days before he died, stuffed a couple trash cans full of papers and set it afire. Now, there's not that much about Chester Arthur that we probably lost. But nevertheless, You know, somewhere there's a struggling PhD student whose career will not be made because Chester Arthur's papers have gone up in smoke. FDR understood that our history belongs to all of us, that it should be brought together in one place where scholars and the general public alike could experience it. And I think that's the genius of the system. They're not libraries. I mean, I've run 5 of them, and I never figured out how to explain to people what a presidential library is. It's easy to say what it isn't. But they are places of scholarship, and they are places of popular scholarship. They are places where PhDs mingle with school kids. And I think that's wonderful, and I hope we never lose it.
Over here.
Yeah. Yep.
Mr. Smith, I'm a student here at the Clinton School, and you've inspired me to go out and buy your book.
I wish I had a book for you to buy. I'm working on one.
My question to you, since you are an expert on Abraham Lincoln, with our current president, you hear a lot of comparisons with him. I just wanted to know your thoughts, and do you think that's a fair comparison?
It's very interesting. You won't be surprised that you're not the first person who's asked me that question of late. First of all, one of the remarkable things about the American presidency is how many presidents identify with Abraham Lincoln. He is the patron saint of unpopular presidents. He is the North Star for embattled presidents, for wartime presidents. I don't think I'm talking too much out of school when I tell you this story. George W. Bush admired Abraham Lincoln, I dare say, as much as his successor. On opening day of the Lincoln Library, I had the privilege of taking the President and Mrs. Bush through the exhibits. And there's a gallery lined with 80 examples of contemporary press coverage. Some cartoons, some stories, all harsh, negative, some very nasty, in ways that make even our own era look polite. And the Bushes were fascinated. In fact, every politician who goes through that building lingers in that hallway for reasons that are probably obvious. And the president said at one point, he kind of, looked around this, lost in thought. He said, he really got his ass handed to him. That sums it up pretty well. But the fact is that because Teddy Roosevelt wore a lock of Lincoln's hair in a ring, he said, whenever I have a difficult decision, I look up at that picture, portrait of Abraham Lincoln. Franklin Roosevelt identified with Lincoln, quoted him repeatedly. What's fascinating is that presidents on the left will use the same Lincoln quotes as presidents on the right. They'll use the same words in pursuit of different objectives. To get to your immediate question, I think, first of all, there are parallels, clearly. When you stop to think of Abraham Lincoln's experience when he became president, he had 8 years in the Illinois legislature and 1 term in Congress, widely seen as unsuccessful. 2 losses in races for the United States Senate. The irony is that his very lack of experience worked to his advantage. His obscurity was a plus, because all the better known Republicans in this young party tended to be very outspoken on the issue of slavery. And Lincoln, as a virtual dark horse, was able to tap into the unease that his more prominent rivals generated. I think beyond that, obviously, there is the issue of eloquence. And I also think that clearly President Obama is at work on the unfinished agenda of the Lincoln presidency, which is race. And again, that's something extraordinarily topical and difficult. But I have to say, I admire a country that is willing to confront its own imperfections and to address moral issues, even if it takes a century or more to resolve them. So I think there are some real parallels. I'm sure President Obama is glad he doesn't have a civil war at his hands, although if you watched Glenn Beck, you might think otherwise. Another question?
Peggy.
You've identified President Lincoln as the first and greatest communicator in the White House. Would you say a word about his speechwriting style?
Well, first of all, imagine a time in American history when politicians wrote their own sound bites. Lincoln did. You know, his staff, to run the Civil War, he had 3 secretaries. First of all, it's surprising. Lincoln was not a very good off-the-cuff speaker. He was not terribly comfortable. You want to read a wonderful book. Read Harold Holzer's new book about the period between Lincoln's election and his inauguration. Lincoln had an incredibly difficult job, which was to go, for whatever it was, through as many states and as many cities and not say anything of consequence to a country that was desperate to hear from its president. But the fact is, he wrote very slowly. He had a severely logical mind. What made him a great lawyer. When he rode the 8th Judicial Circuit in Illinois, we have these wonderful first-hand contemporary accounts from people who were there with him. You know, 4 or 5 men sharing beds in these impossible rural conditions, inns, and one of them remembered, you know, at 4 in the morning, Lincoln, he would open his eyes. Lincoln would be sitting in front of the fireplace, either babbling, talking to himself, or lost in a book. And you know the book was that Lincoln took with him on the 8th Judicial Circuit? Euclid's Geometry. Yeah, not exactly your light summer reading, but revealing of the logical, but what the genius of Lincoln was, he combined this severe logic with this impassioned style. The capacity to make people understand both rationally and emotionally the moral imperatives for which the war was being fought. And one last thing. Remember, you know, you never write the book you set out to write, you never fight the war you think you're fighting. The fact of the matter is, the war in the spring of 1861 was ostensibly justified for a set of purposes that evolved, didn't completely change, but radically evolved over time with the element of racial liberation, if you will, coming to the fore. And no television, no pollsters. Lincoln only had his own sixth sense. How did he keep in touch with people? He understood even then that the president lived in a bubble. And to try to get around that bubble, a couple times a week, he would open the doors of his office for a couple hours and the general public could queue up. Imagine, in the middle of the Civil War, you could walk into the White House. There was no security to speak of. Sometimes Tad Lincoln would be at the bottom of the stairs selling lemonade to the office seekers. He was a war profiteer in his own right. And the president thought it was, you know, vastly amusing, just like when in the middle of an East Room reception, Tad came running through in a kitchen chair drawn by a goat. The people around Springfield thought the Lincolns spoiled their children rotten. But that's because they both had very unhappy childhoods and they didn't want, you know, to have their own kids to relive it. But in any event, what Lincoln did was he called these his public opinion baths. And the people around him said, you're wasting your time, you're endangering your health, you have a war to run, why are you listening to these people? Most of them are office seekers. Anyway, but Lincoln understood this was a war about democracy. And he wasn't going to sacrifice the basic principle for which the war was being fought. He wasn't going to allow himself to become walled up and cut off from the very people whom ostensibly he was leading.
We have time for one
One
more
more?
question. Hold on. Thank you.
I was just going to say, you touched on security. I find it a bit incredible that during a wartime presidency, Mr. Lincoln did not have any security to watch over him at Ford's Theater. Can you comment on just that lack of security at that time?
Yeah, well, you know, it took 2 more presidential assassinations for the Secret Service to really, come into its own. It is astonishing. On the other hand, you can see the other side of the coin. It's remarkable that Abraham Lincoln lived to go to Ford's Theater. The fact is, from the day of his nomination, he was the recipient of death threats. His friends were scared to death. His good friend Ward Hill Lamon, who was appointed Marshal of the District of Columbia, there were some nights Lamon, unknown to the president, would strap his guns and knives and God knows everything else he could to his body and literally stretch out on the floor of the hall in the White House outside the president's bedroom. He was so worried about his friend's security. Because we now know that the assassination plot, of course, began as a kidnapping plot. It was Booth's crazy idea, while the war was still going on, to kidnap the president while he was at Ford's Theater and hold him ransom and secure the release of ex-Confederate prisoners to carry on the war. We surrendered before that could happen. On the night of April 11th, and it's a good note to end on, it gets back to what you were asking earlier. On the night of April 11th, the crowd gathered outside the White House for what they thought was going to be a festive celebration of victory. They wanted to hear tub-thumping oratory. And they didn't hear what they had come to hear. They heard a very sober, very measured, very thoughtful, rather logical, almost legalistic speech from the president touching upon the issues, the challenges raised by Reconstruction and trying to integrate back into the country the states that had seceded. And the president's it's the main window on the north side of the White House. The president's standing in the window, and Tad, he's reading by candlelight, and as he finishes each page, he drops it to the floor, and Tad picks it up. And in the course of his remarks that evening, he did something quite radical. In the context of the time, for the first time publicly, he spoke favorably. He endorsed the idea of black suffrage, of giving the vote to at least some African Americans, and in particular to those who had fought in the Union ranks. In the crowd that night was John Wilkes Booth, who, on hearing this radical declaration, said that's the last speech he'll ever give. And 3 nights later, he proved to be a man of his word. 150 years later, we're still wrestling with the subject that Lincoln discussed in his last speech, and arguably that goes back to the very origins of this country. It's one more reason why Abraham Lincoln lives in a way that I think perhaps no other iconic figure in our history lives. He lives with a relevance and a passion that is unique. And one thing we know in the Lincoln Bicentennial, with all the new books and all the new articles and all the new theories and all the new television programs, this is someone about whom the last word will never be written. Thank you very much.